Good morning, listeners and viewers. Welcome to my podcast, Cross Currents. I'm Rashid, your host, talking to you from Houston, Texas. Today is September 2025. I'm going to start out with the UN General Assembly, which has been meeting in New York City since Monday. On Monday, Saudi Arabia and France co-chaired a special session of the General Assembly to talk about how to reach a two-state solution for the Palestinians and Israelis who have been locked in conflict since the creation of Israel in 1948. In this context, Israel has been fighting Palestinians in Gaza since the Hamas attack on Israel in 2023 on October 7th, and Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, I believe. In return, Israel has killed at least 60,000 Palestinians in the West Bank, including a lot of women and children, and of course men. And Israel does not accept those numbers. They say they're wildly inflated, and they claim that most of the people that they've killed are armed fighters of the Hamas movement in Gaza, which I do not agree with. I think they've killed too many civilians. We've seen pictures of, children and adults being shot straight in the head from behind. And they've caused mass starvation in Gaza by not allowing food aid trucks to go in for many weeks. They've started letting them in again, but only recently. And starvation is still a possibility for the Palestinians in Gaza. So at this meeting on Monday at the UN, notably absent were the U.S. delegation and the Israeli delegation, who boycotted the whole session because they thought that talking about a two-state solution now would be a gift handed directly over to Hamas, which is ridiculous. It's not a gift. I agree with many people that Hamas should not be allowed to rule Gaza anymore. They have been too extreme and too willing to sacrifice the lives of their own people, while the Hamas leadership has been hiding in those tunnels, that tunnel network that they've built under Gaza. Unfortunately, and very sadly, Israel has bombed Gaza, so there is hardly anything left. In the last 2 weeks, they've been sending missiles in to blow up high-rise apartment buildings in Gaza City, and these have all come down. Of course, the Israelis say, we always call the people who live in these buildings and we give them, like a 20-minute warning so that they don't get killed. And I'm just like, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't be demolishing, high-rise apartment buildings that people are living in. It's just nuts. But it goes along with U.S. President Donald Trump's stated dream of his real estate mogul wet dream of rebuilding Gaza into a luxury resort type of area, sort of like Dubai, which I don't think is ever going to happen. And of course, the Israelis or at least the Israeli government, led by right-wing nutcase Bibi Netanyahu and his even more extreme cabinet on the right, they just want to, push all Palestinians out of Gaza. And they were reportedly in talks with Ethiopia to accept some of them, Uganda. It's just ridiculous, For the Palestinians who have been living in Palestine, in the West Bank, in what is now Israel, in Gaza for centuries. You just can't say, you have to leave because we don't like you and we can't deal having to live with you. So anyways, during the meeting at the General Assembly in New York, there were various teleprompter problems and microphones suddenly cut out when leaders were talking. Leaders of many countries talked, but they were each given a very small, limited time since so many wanted to talk. So like the president of Indonesia talked. The head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, had to talk via video from Ramallah in the West Bank because the Trump administration refused to give him a visa to come to New York, proving, once more of how pro-Israel and pro-Zionist the Trump administration is. And some people were blaming Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service agency, for these mishaps. And even when President Trump and his wife Melania went to the UN on Tuesday, as soon as they stepped on the escalator in the lobby, it stopped working. And now President Trump has ordered an investigation into that. President Lula da Silva of Brazil gave a very impassioned speech supporting the Palestinians and saying that peace had to come to Gaza and that genocide is being wreaked upon the Palestinians in Gaza by Israel. And Colombian President Gustavo Petro urged an armed UN force for Gaza, saying that this would be the only way to stop the genocide and come to some sort of and then Chile's President Gabriel Boric called the genocide in Gaza a crisis of humanity, and he called for Netanyahu to be tried by the International Court of Justice. Meanwhile, there's this whole flotilla of small boats that set off from Tunis. They're carrying aid once again to Gaza in the form of food. Of course, this is largely symbolic, but the last time they tried that a few months ago, Israel arrested all of them and deported all of them and did not allow them to give their aid to anybody in Gaza. This time around, again, Israel is threatening to arrest them as soon as they come into Israeli waters. But even worse, Israel has been bombing them using armed drones that they're sending out with bombs. And these drones drop the bombs on these small boats carrying these unarmed activists that just want to help and, show their solidarity with the Palestinian suffering in Gaza. In response to that, Spain has announced that they're sending a military naval escort for the flotilla, which is very good. And then Italy has now said that they're sending two to accompany the flotilla. So hopefully this will make Israel think not once, not twice, but at least 3 or 4 times before they decide to attack the flotilla again. Let's wait and see what happens. In other news today, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, has said that the U.S. government will provide $20 billion bailout to support Argentina's President Javier Milei, who is a close ally of President Trump. The Argentinian economy, as usual, has been doing very badly. Milei was elected president a while ago, and he's extremely right-wing. He's a ferocious supporter of Israel and of Zionism, even though he's not Jewish. Did many severe reforms to the Argentinian economy, such as slashing pensions and slashing government spending on social services a lot. So the Argentinian population has suffered a lot under his administration. But Scott Bessent said that Argentina cannot be allowed to flounder before free market changes can succeed, which really I find ridiculous. The U.S. said they would also help by buying Argentine dollar bonds and giving Argentina credit via the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. Yesterday, on Wednesday, September 24th, the Argentinian peso strengthened 2%, which is not that much. In my opinion, Argentina has always been a black hole in terms of money being poured in either by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who has always been called upon to bail out Argentina from their huge debt that they get themselves into. And, Argentina at one point in the 1950s was one of the richest countries in the world, even wealthier than some European countries at the time in Western Europe, because they were exporting lots of beef and their gross domestic product per capita was quite high. Unfortunately, it's been downhill ever since. So who knows what's going to happen. Now, in other news, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a mutual defense pact, I think last week, and the timing of it was coming shortly after the Israeli attack on the Hamas building in Doha, Qatar. Excited many people who thought, they're doing this now in reaction to the fact that having, a huge U.S. air base in Qatar, which is the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, with many planes and bombs and troops, did nothing to protect Qatar from being attacked by Israel. So many doubts have been creeping into Gulf countries concerning their supposed U.S. umbrella military protection. This started in Saudi Arabia a few years ago when Iran struck the Saudi Aramco oil facilities with drones, and the US government hardly did nothing really in return. This, even though Saudi Arabia is one of the leading oil exporters of the world, and China is their main customer now, not the US and not Europe. But I think the Saudis really realized that they couldn't count on American protection whenever they needed it. And this was during President Biden's administration. So the Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif traveled to Saudi Arabia and met the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and they signed this pact saying an attack on one would be considered aggression on both of them. Many analysts speculated that this meant that Pakistan would be willing to use their nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia if it was attacked by Israel. Other people tried to downplay that by saying, Pakistan is having a lot of its own problems, such as their former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was imprisoned by the military after the military took over the government once again in Pakistan last year, and he's being held under very harsh conditions in solitary confinement, and the government has been repressing all of his supporters, and it's just, a mess. But Pakistan, as well as Egypt, have long been, black holes in terms of Saudi Arabia giving them lots of aid, either in money, dollars, or in the form of crude oil to help their economies. And all of this gets sucked into both countries. There's immense amounts of corruption. We don't know where all the money goes, really. And then after a few years, they come back to Saudi Arabia begging again, saying, oh, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. It's a never-ending cycle of, nonsense. And in Egypt, this week, a leading human rights activist was finally released after being in jail for 10 years. His mother had gone on In other news from Egypt, the Egyptian human rights activist Alaa Abdel Fattah was finally released from prison near Cairo on Tuesday, September 23, after being in jail for around 10 years. He was one of the leading activists during the Arab Spring uprising in Cairo that overthrew the regime of Hosni Mubarak. Shortly after that, he was arrested and charged for posting something that the government didn't like online and sentenced to 5 years in jail. And then they briefly released him, and then he reposted something on his Facebook page that the Egyptian government didn't like, so he was tried again and got another 5 years in jail. So his saga seems to be over for the time being. His mother, who was a math professor at Cairo University, went on a 9-month hunger strike in Britain because they're dual British-Egyptian citizens, both his mother and Alaa. Alaa is married, and his son was born, I think, shortly, not too long before Alaa was arrested for the first time, and now his son, I think, is like 10 years old, and this kid has grown up without seeing his father every day. Egypt continues to be a very ferocious dictatorship. Anybody who criticizes the government, or even if it's constructive criticism, gets monitored, gets called in to the police for questioning, and very often gets put on trial and sentenced to these very harsh sentences, and they end up in jail. Egyptian jails, as you can probably imagine, are really horrific. The conditions are very, very bad. Alaa said in an interview when he was released that when he was first sent to jail, he was kept for 5 days in solitary confinement in a totally dark cell all by himself. So you can imagine the mental torture and anguish that this produces in Egyptian prisoners. I think it must traumatize them for the rest of their lives and, give them PTSD for sure. But, the government of Abdel Fattah Sisi, the current president of Egypt, are very close allies of the U.S. The U.S. does not pressure them that much. The U.S. continues to give them a few $billions a year in aid because Egypt signed the Camp David peace agreement with Israel in 1979. And that's it. Not much hope for Egyptians at the moment. So I hope you've enjoyed my podcast. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.